From Mongolian prince to Chinese emperor, Kublai Khan wasn't born to rule China, but he still conquered it anyway. As the grandson of Genghis Khan, he inherited a legacy of conquest, but Kublai went further than any Mongol before him, founding the Yuan Dynasty and becoming the first foreigner to rule of China. In this conversation, I speak with historian Jack Weatherford. He has written many books about the Mongol Empire, including the one about Kublai Khan, the one we're talking about today, and one about Genghis Khan. And that book has even caught the attention of Elon Musk, who has stated that that is one of his favorite books of all time. In this conversation with Jack, we try to discover how Kublai Khan managed to conquer China as a Mongol Khan. And also after the conquering, what happened? How was he able to unite the people? How was he able to rule an empire filled with different type of cultures? Besides that, we're also going to get into the tactics. How did Kublai think? What were his goals? And how did he manage to achieve his goals? I really believe you'll enjoy this episode. I learned so much in this conversation with Jack, so enjoy. What initially drew you to writing a book about Kublai Khan? Did you think anything was overlooked about his life? What was your motivation for it?
It's interesting because I really didn't have that much interest in him, to be honest. My interest was in the main part of the Mongol Empire from Genghis Khan, and that was the grandfather of Kublai Khan. And so all my research and writing was really about that era of the beginning of the empire. And in my mind, I sort of saw Kublai Khan as the beginning of the end of the empire. He was the fourth of the Mongol emperors, the grandson of Genghis Khan. And I went into the project thinking that this was going to be the end. I was going to talk about the decline. But what I very slowly realized that it wasn't a decline, it was a change. He was becoming not only much more Chinese in orientation, which I knew, of course, but he was also becoming much different from the other Mongols by turning out towards the sea. He was conquering in new ways that the Mongols had never conquered before. And I realized that he really brought the Mongol, could say the Mongol enterprise or the Mongol corporation, the Mongol Incorporated, into a much larger world arena than the land empire had been under the previous Mongol emperors. So it was with that I went into Kublai Khan, and then I ended up changing my opinion about him.
Yeah, so now you have a more positive opinion about Kublai Khan in comparison to before?
I would say I have a more nuanced opinion and a more balanced opinion. It's sort of strange. Some people you can identify with very closely emotionally, and others with only a kind of intellectual way. And I would say with Kublai Khan, for me, it was more the mental part of what he was doing and his strategy, and sometimes his lack of ability as well as his great ability. So overall, yes, I had more respect for him. My emotions did not change a lot. I didn't become terribly attached to him the way I had to some of the other Mongol emperors. Sometimes I'll really like one. Sometimes I really just like the other one. I'm very opinionated. And with him, I'm very mixed. There are great things about him, fascinating and interesting things. And he certainly was innovative in the way he thought. And I respect that tremendously.
Yeah, I have the same feeling when I was reading your book. I didn't necessarily love him, and I wasn't necessarily really rooting for him, but I did respect him. I did see the brilliance in his mind, but I wouldn't call him a genius either, because I did see a couple big mistakes where I was like, it's not like Chengiz, but he's definitely great.
Yeah. So I agree with you in that. I agree with you.
So in this interview, I really wanted to find out, how is it possible that the Mongol ruler, Khan, could actually also become Chinese emperor and also really understand Chinese culture? But I think for us to understand it, we should probably start with the childhood, right? The childhood of Kublai. Could you maybe tell us more about that?
Yeah, there was nothing outstanding in his childhood. His father was the fourth son of Genghis Khan, so he's already far down in the list. All the other sons have already had lots of other sons, so there are many grandsons out there who are much more capable. And even Kublai himself, he has an older brother already who is a very, very Mongol. He's out there fighting with his father in campaigns here and there. And so he's this around the 14th or so grandson that's being born. Nobody expected much out of that at all. His father was in control of the far eastern part of Mongolia, but who was very important to him, not so much his father, but his mother. She was we say a princess, Sorokhtani Bek. She always kept the name princess. She never took the name of queen. But she was a very clever woman who had been chosen by Genghis Khan to marry his youngest son. I think because the youngest son, Tulu was his name. Tulu was a bit of a hothead. He just ran off. He's what your sort of stereotype of what a Mongol might be, racing into battle all the time and not thinking about personal safety or anything. But Sorokhtani was an extremely smart woman. And she seemed to realize the differences in her children, that the first son, Mokhan, he was going to be a very good Mongol, not quite as wild as the father, but a very accomplished one. She could see that. And Kublai Khan, we wasn't Khan then, he was just Kublai. Kublai was not showing any of these great characteristics. In fact, when he first met his grandfather, Genghis Khan, he was about 9 years old. His brother Monk was maybe about 15 years old. And they met the grandfather, and Genghis Khan said, "You're not a Mongol. You don't look like a Mongol." That's a kind of a startling thing for anyone, I think. So, but you look like your mother's people. She'd come
Hmm.
from a different tribe, the Teryak people in the central part of Mongolia. Says, "You look like your mother's people." Well, I think that was probably both true, and it also helped to mark him in life, that he was a little bit different. And Sorokhtani, her husband, died fairly early from alcohol, not in the middle of war, but from alcohol. And she took over his territory, which was mostly eastern Mongolia, but also a big chunk of northern China. For the most part, the Mongols were not very interested in northern China, other than to race in and take out some stuff and all. But Sorokhtani realized the potential of northern China, and she began to cultivate her son. I think that she wanted him to become a sort of governor of the northern China, something vague like that, but as more as a bureaucrat than as a warrior. And so she brought in a lot of various kinds of scholars. She herself had been born into a Christian family. Her father had been nominally Christian, but she had been living in exile among the Buddhists of the Tangut people. So she already had this very mixed influence of Turkic people, of Buddhist, sort of Tibetan style people, of the Mongols. She was much more aware of the world, and she was not radically devoted to any one religion or one culture. She brought these tutors from everywhere to teach her son. So he had an unusual upbringing, and we don't know many of the details of it because he wasn't even important enough for people to be writing about during his childhood. We just have one
Hmm.
little piece here and there, but we know that he was studying a lot, he was learning a lot, and he was also learning about China. Eventually, she appointed him the governor of a province in northern China. Well, he was a young man. He wasn't very interested in going there to rule and do all the stuff you have to do. So he got some good Muslim administrators. The Muslims were so great because, well, first of all, they knew the zero. They knew how to count and they knew accounting, and they could come in and they could do the census, they could do the taxes, they could do everything. The Mongols, they didn't want to bother with all that stuff. And so he brought in Muslim administrators, but they were overtaxing the people. There was a lot of corruption going on. And finally, the mother just sort of yanked his chain and said, "You go now to your province and you rule your province. You go there, administrate." So he went and he slowly began to learn how to be an administrator. So he wasn't fighting the campaigns, he wasn't being a really good Mongol out there, but he was learning how to administer government. So it was a very good training that she gave him. Very good.
Mm. And what was he like as a governor eventually? Was he able to do a good job?
Overall, he did a good job, but sometimes it's hard to understand what his interests were. He
Mm.
he had been educated by these various tutors that we mentioned, Buddhist, Christian, Chinese, all these different types. And he seemed to enjoy debates about religion and theology. Well, that's just not in the cards for a Mongol. That's not the way a Mongol should be. So he was doing this sort of thing, and his older brother, Moghan, when he became the Great Han in 1251, he took over the empire. Then he appointed Kublai Khan to try to settle these religions. It's like, okay, these religions are fussing with each other all the time. We're tribal people. We fight over cows and horses and camels. We don't fight over religion, and we need
Mm.
somebody to handle it. And he turned it over first to his youngest brother, Arikbuk. Arikbuk was too Mongol. He was presiding over the debates, and then he got mad at the Buddhist representative. Uh, sorry, the Taoist representative, and he picked up a broken Buddhist statue and beat the Taoist to death. Well, that's not very good for debate. So Monk Han then turned it over to Kublai Khan, and he asked him to take it over. So he really excelled in that kind of stuff. And he did find actually a kind of balance among the religions and how to restore taxation to some and limit taxation to others. And he did bring some peace to that situation.
Mm. Do we know his personal views on religion?
Well, I think they changed over time. I would say that
Mm.
basically he remained a Mongol, which is that you're primarily worshiping spirits around you. Because I think all Mongols were like that. In that regard, he was a good Mongol. He worshipped what
Hmm.
they call the eternal blue sky, Munchuchtinker, Munchuchtinker. And so I believe that was his deepest one. But on the other hand, he did use the different religions. He recognized, as his grandfather had done, that they had different talents and different perspectives and different abilities. And so, for example, eventually he was the ruler over Tibet. And as the ruler of Tibet, he recognized that the kings were going to, the aristocracy of Tibet would always be against the Mongols. And so he removed them and he put in monks, the lamas, to become the rulers of Tibet because they supposedly would not be having any children. Therefore, they would be creating a dynasty and they wouldn't be quite a threat. So he favored the Buddhists in some ways, but then he also gave certain precedence to almost all the religions at different times.
Mm. Do you think he, like, eventually, when he became Khan, used religion in a strategic way?
Yes. I believe that we could look at two aspects to him. One is what did he believe personally and what was his own life? And about that, it's very difficult to say anything. I can only speculate a little bit. But we look at the other aspect of how he was regulating the policies about religion. And in that regard, I think that because he had so much training in these various religions, he was able to use them more strategically, which sometimes meant using one against the other. And
Mm.
so his grandfather, Kublai Khan, his grandfather, Genghis Khan, had favored the Taoist, for example, and not the Confucianist. He felt like the Confucianists didn't have a religion. He didn't know what they did. The Taoists could supposedly heal people from diseases and they could find the spirits of the land and adjust things. Uh, but the Confucianists, he didn't understand. On the other hand, Kublai Khan was much more favorable towards the Confucianists and the Buddhists as, I think, a counter to the Taoists. It's not that he necessarily favored their beliefs or their teachings, but he saw them as a greater uh, secular power to use against the great power of the Taoists at that time. So yes,
Mm.
he was strategically very good with manipulating religion.
Do you think like this knowledge about religion like really helped him with that? Because you just mentioned that Genghis didn't really understand some of the religions, so I think that's a lack of information. Do you think that helped with Kublai because his mom raised him that way? Like she gave him that information.
Yes, I think it helped him, but Genghis Khan was not really concerned with administering China, so he
Mm.
didn't need that Confucian classic education. He
Mm-hmm.
was off. His favorite places were more Central Asia, Afghanistan. He liked those kinds of areas. And he had long discussions with many, many scholars, including a large number of very good Muslim scholars. He called in all kinds, but he always tended to favor the Taoists, I think, because they were a little bit, we might say, more primitive in their thinking, that with all of their spirits of the land and the mountain and the water, and he could understand that a little bit better. So he sort of
Mm.
figured, well, he wasn't using them to administer anything. He was using Muslims for administration. They were the ones who, as we mentioned, knew the numbers. And he
Okay.
needed people who knew numbers and knew how to work with math, or even like Khorizm, um, the great mathematician of Central Asia, this tradition from which we get the word algorithm today. He was much more
Oh.
interested in that. Then you move over to China, and what Kublai Khan was facing was a much different environment. It was primarily Chinese, even had many other ethnic groups there. It was primarily Chinese, and he used many different groups in different ways. He still used Muslims for administrators for many things that involved numbers in particular. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but he used the Uyghur people in particular very widely for administrative work. He depended on them because his alphabet, or the way of writing of the Mongols, was derived from the Uyghur people. But he sort of slowly realized that he had to rely more and more on Confucian knowledge and traditional Chinese scholarship, because most of his subjects were Han Chinese. Most of his subjects believed in some form of Confucianist teaching, and he found it useful. He never embraced it in a particularly strong or passionate way, but he did find it of limited use to him.
Mm. Okay. Seems like a very smart man in what the religion was. I know it's a super broad question. You just mentioned that he was the 19th grandson, right? 19th?
Oh no, I thought maybe 14th. I didn't actually count them. I'd have to go back.
Okay, well, at least like a very far grandson. How
Yeah,
did he manage to eventually become the great Khan if he's so far away from the throne? I know it's a
yeah,
broad question, but
yes, yes. Ultimately, the real answer is going to be his mother, Soraktani, once again.
Mm,
But to explain the situation, when Genghis Khan was near the end of life, uh, he he was not able to designate a successor because the great Khan cannot do that. It must be chosen by the people after he dies. But he wanted to discuss it with his sons to sort of find one that he could endorse, you might say, in the hope that he would become. And he obviously wanted his first son, whose name was Zuch. But there was a huge flare up. The family was called together. The four sons came together. And the father, by Mongol culture, age always takes precedence. And so you speak in the order of age. And so he proposed this question to his sons, and then he called on Zuch to be the first speaker because that was his eldest son. As soon as he did that, the second son, whose name was Tsagade jumped up and said, if you call on him, that means you want him to be the great Khan. He is not one of us. He is a merchant bastard. He is not one of our family. Well, this related back to the fact that the Genghis Khan's wife, Bertha, had been kidnapped by the merchant, and she came back pregnant after he rescued her. And that first child was Zuch. Zuch means guest in the Mongolian language. Well, Genghis Khan was just sort of, you could just sort of feel it in the accounts that he was rattled by this. But he gave a very passionate, one of the longest speeches of his life. And he said, what do you know? You were not there. You don't know what happened. You came from the same hot womb that he came from. And if your mother could hear your words now, her hot womb would turn into a cold stone. You don't know who she loved. You don't know who she didn't love. The sky and the earth were in reverse, and the stars were coming down, and the earth was going up. You don't know what happened. If I say he was my son, who are you to say he
Mm.
is not my son? Well, Genghis Khan made very good points, but he knew he couldn't convince them of that. And so they had this compromise. Genghis Khan wouldn't allow Sagade to become the great, or wouldn't endorse him because he had spoken out so negatively against the father. They had ruled against it. So they chose the third son, who is Agade. Agade was the most, well, the drunk a lot of the time. So he was very amiable. Fortunately, he was a good drunk, the kind who loves everybody and jokes and laughs and gives out money and that kind of thing. So
My
he was a
favorite
very
drunks.
generous man. And so the brothers agreed that they would follow him. And Sagate said, I think it's a very meaningful phrase that he used about his brother. Yes, we accept him as your son, but a deer shot with words cannot be loaded onto a horse. A deer shot with words cannot be eaten. It was clear they
Mm.
would never accept him, and they didn't. So a good day, the third son was ruling. Well, there's only one more other son out up there, Tolo. He's already dead by this, soon after this, before a good day, at the time of Gudde Han, Tolo died. But Sorachtani, his widow, she took over everything. And Ogude was very smart, even though he was heavy drinking, and so he wanted to marry Sorachtani, either to himself or to his son, because she was so clever and she had great lands in the east. She refused. She wanted to raise her sons. And I think she knew from the beginning that she could outsmart Ogude and Ogude's son. The thing of it is, when Agude died, his wife, Dorigen, took over, and she was almost, I'd say she was as capable as Sorachtani. So Sorachtani very wisely gave obedience to Dorigen. She sent gifts to Dorigen. She made sure that her sons abided by all the laws of Dorigen. But Dorigen's son, who was Nekuik, he was worthless, absolutely worthless. And I think Sorachtani just waited until the power passed to him. And with the power passed to him, she was able to organize a coup, we could say, and get her son Munk, the eldest son, Munk Khan, elected by the other Mongols as the great Han. So you've had this shifting around, and now we've had a great movement. And even though Kublai started off very, very far from the great Khan, now his older brother in 1251, his older brother is the great Khan. And he was, I would say, overall a good general and overall a good administrator, a good Khan. But he died in the campaign against the Southern Song in 1259. So I don't know what Kublai was thinking, but he doesn't seem to have had a very good grasp on the situation. His older brother has died. His other brother is off now in Baghdad. He had just conquered Baghdad in 1258, the year before, so he's kind of busy. He's got Syria on his head. He's even got all the way to Gaza. They had a Mongol station that didn't last very long. So he's very busy in the Middle East, and he's not going to be a contender. And Kublai was actually off on a campaign at this time. Kublai's campaigns had not been very good, and Munk had tried to train him. And so he sent him off to Yunnan province, and he did fine because Monk sent some very good generals, Urihankatai and Urihankatai's son Aju, very good generals to help train Kublai. And then Kublai said, oh, my gout is acting up. He was fat. That gout is acting up. I got to go home. So he went home for a while, and then Monk was outraged. No, get rid of the gout, go back to battle. You've got to cross the Yangtze River. We're going to cross and conquer the South Song. So he went there, and he was on the northern side, of course, of the river, trying to get across the river. And then he gets word that his brother had died. Well, his first thought is, I've got to cross the Yangtze River. This is what I'm told to do. I'm going to try to do it. And he was already negotiating with the Southern Song leaders on the other side in a kind of a ceasefire. He was negotiating with them. But all of a sudden, his wife stepped in. By this time, his mother, Soroktani, was long dead. But his wife, Chabi, she stepped in. She sent him a coded message. And it basically said, forget about the South Song. They're going to be there. You can conquer them later. No problem with that. The problem now is your youngest brother, Arich Bok, the real Mongol in the family, who's still living back there in Mongolia and who beat to death the Taoist scholar with a Buddhist statue. He's going to become the great Khan. You've got to come back and fight this now. And somehow he realized that she was right, so he hastily negotiated this ceasefire with the people, the Southern Song people across the river. They gave him some money so he could come home and say he had won the battle, and he left so the South Song could say they won the battle. Everybody was kind of happy there to get the Mongols out of the way, and he came back and basically had a civil war with his brother, which that's what I thought was the beginning of the end of the Mongol Empire, because it was a huge change. The two brothers went to war. One was very Mongol, Arif Buk, the youngest, and he had all the allies in Central Asia behind him. Kublai, not yet the great Khan, Kublai was not such a great warrior, but he had China, and he had the great resources of China. The resources of Mongolia and Central Asia are not very much compared to the resources of China. Kublai won. And then he took his brother captive. He was organizing investigation and a trial, and the brother died mysteriously, like so many Mongols of that era, mysteriously. And then Kublai was the great Khan of the Mongol people, not the Emperor of China. He had not taken that title, but he was the great Khan. So all this going on with the brothers and the movement, I would say the two crucial actors in the end were Soroktani, his mother, and Chabi, his wife. And this is where he begins to come into his own. He's a different man. Once he becomes the emperor, he is a different man.
What you do notice is women play a really big role in his life. Like, he does really listen to them.
Yes,
And
especially to
the
those two, his mother Soroktani and his wife Chabi. And with actually much, much later, during the invasion of Japan, Chabi died. And I think he never recovered from that. Never.
Yeah, I read about the heartbreak in your book. It was very sad. When he became Great Khan, like, did they accept him in the first place? Or was he still seen as very Chinese for the Mongolians?
The Mongols in China, I would say, accepted him because they were already in China. They were under his authority, and they accepted him. Now, the Mongols back in Mongolia and in Central Asia did not accept him. They did not.
Okay. And the reason is because they saw his brother as the legitimate ruler.
Yes, and because he was becoming ever more Chinese, he declared himself an emperor of China and created the Yuan Dynasty in 1271. And the Mongols of Central Asia, the descendants of Tsagade and the descendants of the other Mongol princes, they did not like that. He also did many things to change some of the Mongolian laws that they didn't like in favor of Chinese laws. And they objected to that greatly.
Were those like his first actions when he became Chinese emperor, like turning the Mongolian part of the empire more Chinese, so put in more Chinese laws, etc.?
Yes, some of it was from Chinese laws, but also the Mongol system that had been set up by Genghis Khan was more of a corporate system. And that is, you had Mongols ruling different areas. So you had Shuch's family ruling Russia, the Golden Horde. You had Tulu's family in northern China, and all these different families. But every family owned property and tariff, produce, tribute in every part of the country. So Kublai's brother, Kublai Khan's brother, Kublai's brother, Hulegu,
Mm.
his brother was in Baghdad at this time in Central Asia, but he still owned silk factories in China. So you had all this money being transferred back and forth, or goods really, tribute back and forth. And Kublai Khan, he more or less took over that system. He said, well, we, the government here, will start collecting the money for you and we will start paying you out. It was like they get a dividend rather than getting the actual tribute. So these were
Mm.
some things that the Mongols objected to in the other parts of the country. Actually, Huligu's own family in the Ilkhanate in Persia and in Iraq, they they actually accepted him, but the ones in Russia and the ones in Central Asia objected much more so.
Mm. Okay. And was this also the moment like that he already had his eyes on the Song dynasty, like taking over that part of the empire?
Yes, I think from the
So,
time of
mm,
from the time of Genghis Khan, that was the greatest object was the
mm,
song, and
yeah,
this then became his obsession. It was already the obsession of a good day before them and of his brother uh, Monk. They were all obsessed with China, and they had not made great progress into southern China, south of the Yangtze River. In the north, they were fine.
because the part in your book about the conquering of the Song dynasty is probably my favorite part of the book. Like, it's
You see?
fascinating how they did that because he had to basically turn like a Mongol type empire and like transform their whole mindset about the waters and the way of warfare, etc.
Yes, yes.
But before we get into that, like how did he conquer them? Could you help us understand like how powerful was the Song dynasty and why was it so hard to conquer them in the first place?
The Song Dynasty is one of the greatest dynasties of Chinese history. In almost every regard, with their technology, with their literature, with their art, with everything about it. But like every dynasty in the world or every civilization, it decays over time. And they had been in power altogether for about 300 years. And they ruled China, but there were three waves of people coming from the north pushing them south. The first were people called the Khitan, who were sort of cousins, we might say, to the Mongols. And they had created they created the Liao dynasty. They were replaced by the Jin dynasty, which was the Jushid people of Manchuria, and they pushed the Song farther south. And uh, the Song, at first, of course, in the far north, they had a few little mud walls, nothing like the Great Wall we think of today. Just some mud walls and some big ditches. They were good at building big ditches. Well, that didn't stop the nomads. It didn't stop any of the people from the north. So they kept going farther south, and then they changed their tactic. Instead of having mud walls and ditches, they would have a great green wall. And that was they would plant a huge area of 100 kilometers or more with trees and make it into a forest. And they would fill it with ponds along the way and little channels and rivers and irrigation ditches in order to stop. Well, it was an excellent system. It was natural, it was renewing itself. It kept, because the northern horsemen, to get through a forest with them is very difficult. And you have a forest that's riddled with streams and ponds and little rivers. That's even more difficult. So the Great Green Wall was extremely effective, but it's also extremely tempting to other South Song people because now you've got these great massive trees growing. Oh, there's timber to be had. It's filled with animals, all kinds of animals living out there that you can hunt, and feathers and furs and all kinds of exotic medicines, and waterfowl in the little ponds and lakes, and lots of fish. And they kept encroaching on it till finally there was no green wall left. So by 1127, then the Jin, the Justit people, the Jin of North, they had pushed the song all the way to the south, south of the Yangtze, basically. And so then after that, history calls them the South Song or the Southern Song. They're more longer just a song. So this is what the Mongols were facing. They came in, they first had to defeat the Jin. Well, they did that. It wasn't overly difficult. The interesting thing about that is that the Jin capital, which is now Beijing, the Jin capital was conquered in the year 1215 by Genghis Khan. But that's a year that Kublai Khan was born. He was born in September that year. So he was born the year that they conquered the northern part of the Jin. But it's taken years and years and years to keep pushing back. And finally, to conquer the Jin completely took until the time of Kublai Khan, after Genghis Khan's death. And then they only faced the South Song. But that was the greatest empire in the world, you could say. It was the most powerful, the most technologically sophisticated. It produced the most stuff. It's just amazing amounts of stuff that they could produce for world trade. And this became then the obsession, the inherited obsession of the Mongol Khans. And it was Kublai Khan who's the one who finally succeeded.
And like, what were the main difficulties that Kublai ran up against with trying to invade that part of the Chinese empire?
Water. It was water.
Mm.
The Yangtze River is this huge, almost like a flowing ocean. It's so big and wide. This giant river there. And then, of course, the coastline itself. All of this was the protection. And the song had the Great Green Wall, which was trees mostly. And then now they had what they called the Great Wall of the Sea, or the Great Water Wall. They would be protected by that. And it was a very good, once again, a good policy. And they built a navy to protect themselves, a coastal navy, and also a navy for a riverine navy on the Yangtze River, and some ancillary rivers also, tributaries. So they had a very good protection. This was the great problem that Kublai Khan had to face. How to conquer this great wall of water. And he was really struggling with that. The first response was, okay, we'll go far, far, far to the west, to where the rivers are very small, and we will conquer over there, and then we will come in from the west on the other side. But even that proved difficult. And so they were up in some of the northern cities, and then we have a young general named Aju, whose father had been an earlier general Urihankadai, and whose grandfather was the greatest conqueror in history, I would say. That was Subadai. Subadai was the great strategist for Genghis Khan. So Aju is the grandson of this great strategist. And earlier, back in the time of Mongol, Aju had been with his father, Urihankadai, in the invasion of North Vietnam. At that time, they were following this strategy. We're going to go around the Song Dynasty. We're going to conquer the far west. We're going to conquer the south, and then we're going to move in. And we don't have to cross the Yangtze River. We're going to avoid that. Well, he came down the Red River in northern Vietnam against, it was a Dai Viet empire. And they were reasonably successful. They came in from Yunnan province, so far from the west, the northwest. They came down, and they met the army of the Dai Viet emperor at the Red River. Well, the two armies faced each other across the river. The Dai Viet had come up mostly on boats, but they had a large contingent of elephants. The other side, you have the Mongols and their horses, which are not doing so well. in this Mongolian climate and without grass lands, open pastures, and they're not so great. But Urihankadai figured out, okay, what we have to do is for the elephants, they already knew from Burma, we attack the feet with fire. That will panic the elephants. But then the men will probably flee to their boats. And so we've got to send out a detachment of people to burn the boats first before we attack. Well, that was the great plan. So Irihankadai had a good plan. He explained it to the officers. They went out there. But Mongols don't always follow the plan, and they want to get into action. And the idea of going to burn boats, wait, the fighting is over there. So the guys who were sent to burn the boats suddenly were in the middle of the battle. Well, the Mongols won the battle. The elephants routed in fear for the fire. But the North Vietnam soldiers just went back to their boats and sailed off back to what's today Hanoi, back to their capital. So he had won the battle, but he had lost. This is very common in Vietnamese history. You can win and still lose, But so they marched down the river towards Hanoi. But the Vietnamese took everything they could take out of Hanoi, all the food, everything, and they fled off into the marshlands of the Great Delta area of the Red River. So Aju had seen all this. He was with his father. He understood the importance of water. He understood the importance of boats. This is the most important thing of all. The Mongols lost that expedition. They had to return to China. They had failed to conquer North Vietnam. So much later, when we get to the time of Kublai Khan, it's already now the 1270s, when we're there with Kublai Khan, that we find that Aju is trying to think in a new way. And he is going up and down the rivers. He really explored the rivers to make sure he understood the craft that were used, understood the little rivers, the big rivers, all of this. And he recognized something very important. The Chinese cities were built with incredible fortification, and the Mongols could not break the fortification. But the fortification was extremely strong on the land side. On the water side, it was relatively weak. The walls were smaller, not well defended. They had not built great walls because they never expected anybody to attack them from the water. They only expected the Mongols to attack by land. So he thought, okay, how do we attack them by water? And the idea was, if we could get catapults loaded onto boats, or trebuchets, but are catapults, we could say, but trebuchets. But they didn't have actually the technology. China had very good catapults, but they didn't have exactly what he needed. And those would come from the Muslim countries of Central Asia, the Mongol Ilkhanate. So they asked Kublai Khan to send them some engineers from Central Asia, from Middle East, from Persia, and from Iraq. And they sent the engineers there, and the engineers, through trial and error, they were able to adapt these trebuchets, these catapults, to the boats. It's a very difficult thing to do because when the thing fires, it's going to be tremendous power. You have to keep the boat afloat and all. But they perfected it. They invaded the cities of the upper reaches of the Yangtze, and they broke through the walls faster than the people inside could repair the walls, and they conquered them. So Aju, through these excellent engineers who had helped him, he came up with a strategy, and they were able to make it happen, and he was beginning the conquest of southern Song, only beginning.
And what was the morale like of the soldiers during that battle? Because I can imagine, as you mentioned in your book, the Mongolian soldiers weren't fan of boats. They despised boats, you could nearly say. Would you say like the soldiers were mostly Chinese if they had to go on a boat, or was it Mongolians who were convinced eventually, or what did that look like?
Yes, the Mongolian attitude towards boats, the first time Kublai Khan came in and they had faced a river back in the campaign against Yunnan earlier, they had crossed on goat skins attached underneath rafts because the soldiers, the reason they didn't like boats was because in the Mongol culture on the steppe, of course, there are no boats there because the rivers aren't big. But on the steppe, women owned the carts. Wooden carts are all owned by women, all managed by women, all driven by women. A man will not drive it. He's got to be unconscious before you can put him on a cart. But if he has to guide the cart, he will be on his horse and just guide it. He will not get in it. That's a very strict division. Well, a boat is a lot like a cart floating on the water. And that
Mm-hmm.
just wasn't manly. That just was, they would rather go over on a goat skin being pulled by the tail of their horse, because at least that's a manly thing. You've got your horse, you've got the goat skin. If you're doing a Mongol thing, you're not in a cart. So it was a big problem, but Aju himself helped to overcome that by he personally would go out in the boat, and sometimes he took command of the boat. He would help with the steering of the boat. He showed the men. I don't think he totally convinced them, but the fact that they were beginning to win certainly was convincing. All the technology for the boat was Chinese. We could say that the technology for the weapons was from the Ilkhanate, from Iraq and from Persia. But the boat itself was all, and the Mongols adapted to it. And I can't say they ever embraced it totally, emotionally, but they adapted. They saw the effectiveness of it, especially as long as you could have Chinese helping to operate the boats. Then you had these engineers helping to operate the catapults. They were willing to go along with it and have a horse somewhere close by.
Well, this channel is mostly about like studying people before you so you can kind of like implement that later in your life. And you also see that with this invasion, right? Because there was someone else, I don't remember the name, but he tried to invade the Song dynasty like 100 years before Kublai, correct?
Mm.
And like what mistakes did he make which Kublai was able to not make because he studied?
Yes. Fortunately, Kublai Khan was fairly good with history and learning from the past. He was a little bit better than many of the others. And the Jin dynasty had also created a navy. They had also recognized in their campaign against the South Song earlier, they had recognized that the way is we have to have a navy in addition to an army. They did a miserable job of it. First, they got some boats, some river boats, and they lured a couple of engineers from the South Song. And see, craftspeople weren't well respected among the Han Chinese of South China. They respected Confucianist scholarships and calligraphy and music and everything else. But people who built things weren't so well respected. But in the north, the Jin and later the Mongols respected them more and paid them more. So they would defect. So anyway, the Jin built their own navy to attack. But it was a beautiful navy. And they made beautiful big red sails to go on these boats that were made along the river. And to make them just more beautiful, they coated them with oil so they just would glisten in the sun. And they would just go along and the waves would be flowing and the sun glistening. And oh, what a beautiful navy. So they sent it out. Well, first of all, they had no idea where they were going and they got lost. It was a river navy and not really appropriate for the ocean. When they saw the South Song fleet attacking, they didn't realize it was the South Song. They assumed it was their friends, so they didn't even prepare for battle. And when the South Song Navy came up, here are these bright red sails out there on the water, glistening in the sun, and they just started firing flaming arrows, which immediately set the sails on fire. And the Jin had packed the ship with soldiers. That's what they thought would win the war. Packed it with soldiers, heavily armed soldiers who were going to fight on the land. Well, they can hardly move around, and now this red oil and these cloth, these bamboo sails are falling on them. They're falling into the ocean. They're drowning. The fleet was wiped out. So the Jin had failed completely in their effort to break through the Great Wall of the Sea of the South Song. And Kublai Khan knew that, and he recognized they had to build different kinds of ships that were appropriate for the sea. Don't put oil on on the sails and don't have red sails. These are simple little lessons, but they helped a lot.
Yeah. And eventually he beats the Song dynasty. Can you
Yes,
tell me something about how he handled the former emperor and his family? Because I found that very interesting.
yes. If I could add something before that, before
Yes,
he
of course.
defeated the South Song, he tried to invade China. I'm sorry, he tried to invade Japan from China, and he failed miserably in that one. So they hadn't yet worked out all the techniques. So I think that failure was extremely important to him in working out better tactics for the ocean. I think he'd
Mhm.
intended to show the South Song he wanted them to surrender after they saw the surrender of Japan. Japan did not surrender. His fleet was destroyed. And the South Song court was just going on. First of all, they didn't even know that their cities were being lost up on the river because the generals were lying. They didn't want to be punished for losing. And so the court was down there in Hangzhou, and the court was going on as though everything's fine. We didn't even know we're losing this war. And then the Mongols have been defeated by Japan. By who? Japan? Oh, we don't have to worry about that, Nate, you know. So they're very complacent. But of course, the Mongols are advancing step by step by step. Mongols are persistent and able to keep going tremendously long times with a plan. The Navy was improving with every step of the way. Every defeat made it better, made it stronger, made them new tactics. There were new ways of building boats. All of these things were happening. And so gradually, or not so gradually, it began to accelerate very fast. They conquered down the Yangtze. They're beginning to conquer down the coastline. And then the general in charge was not Aju. The general in charge was a Mongol named Bayan. He was a very capable, wonderful person in history. He wasn't so much a military strategist as Aju was, but Kublai liked him. Kublai Khan often played, just as he played one religion against another, he would often play one general against another.
Mm.
And Aju had actually grown up in the Middle East, and he had been sent there from their cousins. So he was a very sophisticated, cosmopolitan person, and he brought great color to the court. Later, Marco Polo would be that kind of a person, where you're young and sophisticated from just because they knew some other place. Well, Bayan had been appointed head of the military, and it was a blow for Aju, whose father and grandfather had been the head of the military for so long. But Aju accepted it. Aju was so faithful to the mission, so loyal, and he and Bayan actually worked together very well. They refused to be rivals to each other. They
Mm.
cooperated, and Bayan recognized the superior talents of Aju. So together, they had worked down the Yangtze River, conquering city after city, and then finally in 1279 they came to Hangzhou, the capital of the Southern Song. The Southern Song had a bunch of emperors, some of whom may have been imbeciles, others of which were spending their time on boats with musicians and beautiful women floating around in the lake instead of building new boats to defend a country. They thought they were safe behind their great wall of the sea. And their tactic was a very simple one that, okay, we're going to build a great wall of ships. That means we build all the ships, and then when the people attack, we chain them together in a great wall. Okay, they've lost all mobility. That tactic did not work. The Mongols figured out how to dart in and out and how to break the chain, how to do everything. And by 1279, they came in, they were ready to take Hangzhou. At that time, the emperor was a child, and the ruling power was a dowager empress named Xie. Xie is very controversial in the history, but I would just say I like her. I respect her. She's often called Ugly Xie because she was supposedly not attractive. She only had one eye. She had never been loved by her husband, the emperor, but she tolerated and she loved all of his wives. She took care of them. She was a very talented woman and she knew how to use the court. Xie's generals, one by one, were deserting. They were running away. Most of them left their own families right there in Hangzhou, and they would escape on the boats going farther south. She recognized that all the main cities had been taken, that there was nothing left they could do, and if they fought the Mongols, she knew the Mongol strategy. If you surrendered, they would guarantee your safety. That was a law from the time of Genghis Khan. If you fought against them, they would kill you. It's just like that. And she said there was no need for the people of Hangzhou to die for something that the generals would not defend. And so she tried to negotiate with Bayan to surrender. And over he said, no, we just surrender. She wanted to keep the emperor as a puppet or let him be a king. And they said, no, you surrender totally. That's only unconditional surrender. That's all we accept. And finally, she accepted unconditional surrender. She said she would. So Bayan came with a small detachment to the city, to the capital, and they entered to go look around the city and inspect what they had conquered. She was still in the palace with the emperor and the court, and she sent word that she would like to surrender to him. And he said, he was sort of overly modest, fakely modest, and saying, well, I don't know the protocols of the palace, and I don't know the protocols of the Chinese court, and I should not come to that. You should come to the Mongol camp to surrender. What he wanted, of course, was the soldiers had fought for this victory, and they deserved to see the surrender. He was not going to harm her or the child emperor, but they deserved to see the surrender. And so it was orchestrated in that way. Xie came out with the child emperor. They went to the Mongol camp. They surrendered before the Mongol soldiers. They bowed down towards Beijing, which was where Kublai Khan was ruling, and they accepted it. For that, she's often called a traitor, that she ended the great Song Dynasty, and it was great, there's no denying that. The men had not defended it. The generals had lost the war. The navy had run away. But it's an old, ugly, one-eyed woman who's going to take the blame for 300 years of history. No. Xie saved the life not only of the young child emperor, whom she took with her to Beijing. Well, actually, they went separately. He went first, and then she came. But she had saved his life, but she saved the whole city. Now, the city would, of course, be, we would say, looted, but it would be looted in a very organized, systematic way of records being kept and the things mostly from the palace. It's not that the homes were being looted, but the palace, all the records, all the art, everything from the Song Dynasty would be taken north to Beijing. But Xie was given a palace. The young prince was given a palace. The emperor, he's now a prince. They gave him a title of prince, Wang, and she retained the title, and so they lived on for many years. She died in Beijing, and his fate much later in life was going to be different. But they were received with hospitality, but they were also, you could say, an exhibit of the new Mongols. This is Kublai Khan's new Mongol world, and we don't treat the enemy the way that we treated the past. We don't kill them off. We bring them on and we let them have a nice life if they surrender. So the Song Dynasty had officially ended, but there was still going to be opposition from those ships that had sailed away.
Yes. And before we get into that, there was also a moment that Kublai's wife started tearing up, right? When she saw the queen giving up, correct?
Yes. This is what it said, that, of course, by tradition, all this stuff brought from the palace in Hangzhou, all this beautiful artwork from the centuries and all, that she would have the first choice of anything she wanted. Chabi was a very frugal woman. She was noted for always sewing and repairing things, and being very, even bowstrings. She would recycle the bowstrings after the war to use for the. So she wasn't a wild, extravagant, luxurious kind of woman, but she saw all this great wealth being brought up And she said, no, she would not take anything because today it's a Song dynasty, but one day it will be the Mongols who lose.
Mm.
And so she
She
wanted
knew
to show
that's the
great
course of
mercy.
history.
Yes,
Hmm.
yes.
Yeah, she knew
That,
that's always the course of history. All empires fall eventually.
yes, yes,
Mm.
yes.
And what happened afterwards with what you just told me, like the court, like a few important members of the court, they were able to flee.
A lot of them fled. They had a bunch of ships. They took the ships. They fled towards the south. And then they had a couple of brothers from the emperor. So now he was a prisoner, as they called it. Oh, he was. He was a prisoner. The emperor and the Empress Xie, they were up in Beijing now. And so this renegade navy, they appointed one of the little brothers as the emperor. Then they're sailing around and they're not finding a lot of support, in large part because in the south, the merchants had mostly been Muslim merchants. The Chinese were great at producing, but they had relied heavily on Muslim merchants for the transportation and for the ships. And the Muslim merchants also were quite aware that in Chinese society, merchants, like craftsmen, artisans, ranked rather low, but among the Mongols, they ranked extremely high. They were right there, well above Confucian scholars and people doing calligraphy and all of that. They were highly valued. And so the Muslim community in the south sided with the Mongols, and that effectively kept the ships from landing for very long and for making a base in the south. So they're floating around. Here's this navy with no country floating around. Well, I don't know what happened, but they somehow dropped the young emperor in the ocean. And it was a storm or something going on, or maybe he was thrown in. We don't know. But by the time they fished him out, he was almost dead, and he lived on for only another short time, a couple days, and he died. So now they've got to find out. Well, they have one more brother. This is going to be the last little boy. He's not yet 7 years old, and so they go to land and they have a big ceremony to make him the new emperor, and then they sail off, but they can't find refuge, so they're going to try to head toward northern Vietnam because a lot of other Song people had settled in Vietnam and found refuge there. But the Dai Viet of northern Vietnam, they were not anxious to have this exiled court come in. They really liked the Song. They sided with them in many ways, but they realized history had shifted. And what were they going to do? So fortunately for them, the fleet never made it there. They settled on a small island, not so far from what's now Hong Kong, there, and they set up a base. But with their nonsense way of thinking about things, the first thing they wanted to do was build a palace for the high official. Well, your navy without even a country, you found some island and you're going to build a palace? So they split their other resources and they built a palace. Well, it took a while for the Mongols to find them, but especially with all of these Muslim navigators, they were quickly located. So the Mongols, they had to assemble another fleet. It took a little while to get there, a few months, and they went there. And so the Southern Song renegades who were there, they decided to defend it in the typical Southern Song way. They chain all their boats together across the harbor. And then in the middle, they build a palace boat. And they take the little emperor out there. He's now just had his 7th birthday. And they take him out there. This is in 1279. And they take him out and they put him on the boat. And this poor child, he just has one friend in the world. That's a parrot. He's there with his little parrot pet. And he's in the middle of this war that's about to break out. And the people around him, they've deserted the land. They've gone to the ships. And so what do the Mongols do? They immediately send their troops onto the land. They take over the land. Well, the land is higher than the ships. So now they occupy the high land around, and now they can just fire down onto the ships. And the ships are chained together. They can't get away. And they can't get firewood and they can't get water. So soon the men are drinking having to drink the seawater. They're having to eat rice that hasn't been cooked because they have no fire to cook it. They're in terrible shape. They're dying from dysentery and various diseases. And they're going to lose. And the Mongols repeatedly ask the former Song officials to surrender. Please surrender. We will guarantee it. We've done this with the other brother. We will guarantee everyone's safety and all. But the prime minister, of course, is arrogant, and he's not going to surrender, and he considers the Dowager Empress Xie to be a traitor to the country. And the child emperor, the other child, he's only a child. How could he be a traitor to the country? He's considered that. So they're fighting, and the Southern Song army is, of course, losing because it's all on ships. There's nothing it could do on ships that are being fired upon. They're chained together. And even when some of the Song people try to rescue the little emperor, the minister won't allow it. He won't allow that. He's afraid that they will rescue him and then perhaps sell him to the Mongols or give him to the Mongols or do something. And so first, the prime minister throws his wife and his own family into the sea to drown. Then he takes the child and holds it in his arms, and he jumps into the sea with them. And in the confusion, the parrot cage came loose and fell into the sea. 300 years of one of the greatest civilizations or the greatest dynasties in history ended in an act of murder, the assassination of a child who is exactly 7 years and 1 month old. This child and his parrot, the child emperor and the parrot, die in the waters. That's the end of the glorious Song dynasty. Finished.
That doesn't seem like a real story.
Yeah, history is always more unbelievable than fiction, you know? It's just, humans have this capacity for self-deception, for arrogance, for so many things like this that could lead us to do some of the worst acts imaginable. But to kill your own emperor, a child, to kill your own family because you don't want to surrender to the Mongols out of pride.
It's unbelievable. Yeah, I think you've probably seen that quite often while studying for all your books, those type of people.
Yes, we do see it, yes.
Kublai now is arguably the most powerful person on earth, you could say.
Yes, I mean, certainly he's of the most powerful country now. He has by
Yeah.
far the most powerful navy, and he
Mhm.
has the largest empire. Yes.
But now he's got like a different problem, right? A different problem than Genghis Khan probably ever had. It's like all these different cultures in one country. How did he manage that? Like, how was he able to unite in some form, maybe?
He became, certainly to the Chinese subjects, who are most of his subjects, the Han people, Han Chinese, he became more Chinese. So he began doing rituals that were Chinese and looking Chinese. And then but for the Mongols, he tried to appear still Mongol. So he had two capitals. He had a summer capital, which was in Inner Mongolia. We call it Xanadu, after the great poet. In Xanadu did Kublai Khan, the pleasure palace decree. So he had that, and there he lived on horseback, and he lived with the Mongols, and he was the Mongol great Khan. And then the rest of the year he lived back in Beijing, and he was the Chinese emperor of the empire. So he managed to, with his ability earlier on with these different religions and playing one general against another, he was still fairly good politically, and he continued to do this, sometimes with deadly results, but he continued to do this. His greatest opposition, so he's being successful in China. He's actually most of the minority nations, and he's being able to rule them. But the people who are against him are the Mongols, and especially the Mongols of Central Asia and Western Mongolia. They refuse to recognize him as great Han. of the empire, much less to recognize him as the emperor of China. It would be very important because their areas are not quite so rich, but they control the Silk Route. China is the greatest producer in the world, especially southern China. He's just conquered the workshop of the world, all the great silk that would come out of it, all the great porcelain, everything. And he can't sell it because the Silk Route is closed. It's controlled by his cousins or the children of his cousins who are now against him. So he has to turn once again to the sea. He failed to conquer Japan by sea, but he controlled the sea. Even
Mhm.
Japan had no access to trade without going through the Mongols, without having peace with the Mongols. So he controlled it all the way from Japan and Sakhalin Island off the coast of Russia, all the way to Hormuz in Iran today, Persia, on the Persian Gulf. He controlled the sea. And so then slowly he began to see. I think slowly and not completely in his lifetime. At the end, I don't think he completely understood even the power that he had. But he was moving from the aggressive navy, and that's what it was, an offensive navy. Mongols had never built anything defensive in their life. They never had a wall for anything, nothing defensive. Everything was offensive. And he changed the defensive Song Navy to an offensive navy. But it wasn't succeeding very well. They even tried to conquer Java, North Vietnam, Japan. They weren't conquering. They controlled the sea, but they couldn't control the land. But gradually, they were taking over commerce. And that was very important. Commerce.
Because you just said like Kublai didn't completely understand the powers that he had. In what do you exactly mean by that? Do you see like opportunities where Kublai could have um, improved, or opportunities that he didn't completely benefit from?
Well, yes, there's several levels to it. One is he never even created a really good legal code for China. You had different laws in different areas. You had the Mongol law, you had Chinese law, you had the South Chinese law, and he never quite got it all organized into one law. That was a problem on land. But the greatest problem was that he had this tremendous navy. And first of all, you know, you want to keep them busy. You don't want this big military force in the world just sitting around. And so I think that's one reason he had invaded Japan again after the conquest of southern China. But also, we assume that he just wanted to control the land of Japan. And I really don't think that's true. I don't think controlling Japan was very important to him. What he had was a bigger problem. He had about 1 million soldiers from southern China. And where are you going to put them? What are you going to do? He had sent some way up into Siberia, the Amu River, but not too many could go there. He had sent expeditions into Tibet to explore what's a possibility. Well, it's not going to house too many people. But Japan seemed for him a great place to put the soldiers. So most of his fleet actually was composed of Song soldiers, South Song soldiers. Mostly they were unarmed. They were armed with hoes and picks and arrows, because what he wanted to do was to create a colony there that would be growing food that they could ship back to China. And that would keep them far away on an island. And this problem, oddly, tragically, was solved by the invasion because the ship sank. He did not kill these men, they died in the typhoon. But the problem was largely solved. They were gone. The soldiers were no more. They weren't going to rebel against him. They weren't going to go crops in Japan for him, but that was a minor consideration. And it was actually after that that then they finally decided to send the Chinese, the Southern emperor, who was a grown man now, a middle-aged man. They sent him off to Tibet to become a monk, to live out his life as a monk. Uh,
Mm.
they didn't send the army with him. No need to have an army around him. Uh, that the monks would take care of his safety and keep him out of the way. So he was still, Kublai Khan was still, he was thinking in new ways, but he wasn't completely in the new mindset. He didn't
Yeah.
understand how important the trade was. It wasn't going to be just having a agricultural colony in Japan to ship back food. It was to control whatever Japan was producing, whatever Persia was producing, whatever South China was producing. He was almost there in his thinking, but not quite. It was going to be his
Mm.
successor who completed this process.
How much of like a effect on the Chinese culture did Kublai have on like spreading the Chinese culture? Would you say there's still traces of that today?
I think the most important is just the map. You look at
Mm.
China today, it is mostly that is the China that Kublai Khan conquered. That's not from the earlier dynasties, because he included things such as Tibet, for example. But he also included, of course, part of Mongolia never successfully, and that's not a part of it today. So the map you see today is almost identical with the map of the empire that he created. So that's one of the important things for him. The other is then he did organize the first expedition from Chinese ships from China to the Middle East, to Hormuz. And that began a great exchange. It had already been going on over land to some extent by the Silk Route, but it's limited by the disruption of the wars with his relatives. But now all of a sudden there's a flow of people. And this great expedition, it was nominally to send back a princess called Huxjin. She was going to become the wife of the Ilkhan, the Mongol ruler of Persia and Iraq, or what they called it, the two Iraqs is what they called it. But he was going to be she was going to be the wife of the Mongol who's ruling there. And Marco Polo and his fathers, they realized Kublai Khan was about to die. He was very close to death, and consequently, they wanted to get out with their great wealth because they didn't know. He was the first Yuan emperor. Is this Yuan dynasty going to even last? Maybe he dies and it's over. The Chinese take over again. They didn't know. They wanted to get out. So they asked him, begged him for permission to return home to Venice. And so he allowed them to go on this expedition back to Hormuz. And then from Hormuz, they crossed over by land and then over the Mediterranean back. And so this was the first great exchange of carrying goods to the Ilkhanate, and then when the convoy returned, a returned convoy very soon after, it also carried a lot of goods from the Middle East. So it wasn't just Chinese culture spreading, but it was going in both ways.
Mm.
Kublai Khan attempted to impose a lot of the Chinese ways on the Middle East. It did not work. A few things worked, but mostly didn't. For example, he had a paper currency system that he'd inherited from the Song. He greatly expanded it and developed it in China. It worked fine in China as long as the government was strong because people were accustomed to it. So they decided to introduce that to the Middle East. They were going to make the two Iraqs, Persia and Iraq, they were going to make them use paper money. That failed. Or those people had never heard of paper money. They knew about coins, they want gold. Everything withdrew from the market. The people fled the city. Chaos was reigning. They had to end that experiment. So a lot of his efforts failed. Kublai Khan was trying very hard to create a naval alliance with Europe, of all places, because he wanted to invade Egypt. Egypt was very important to him. They had failed. They had this outpost at Gaza, and the Mamluks had come in and chased them out, pushed them all the way back up into Syria. They had lost
Mm.
all of that. So Kublai Khan, he was smart enough to understand that, okay, the way to invade Egypt really isn't through Gaza, that little tiny area. The way is going to be by ships. And he wanted to do it in two ways. Get the Europeans to come across the Mediterranean from Italy and invade with their ships because they were very good. But also get the Europeans to build some ships in, in Baghdad, of all places, to build the ships, they come out the river and then sail into uh, Egypt. That pincer movement, very Mongolian traditional movement. Well, that failed. It failed because his allies in Europe, so-called, deserted him. They really weren't very interested in the Mongols. The Mamluks could pay them more in trade and tribute, and so all of that failed. So Kublai was very involved in transporting his ideas and Chinese culture. Some worked, some did not.
Mm. And like, what did it eventually look like, the death of Kublai? It was quite peaceful, right?
I'm sorry.
Eventually Kublai passed away. It was in a
Oh,
quite
yes,
peaceful manner, right? In
yes,
comparison to most
yes, yes.
Mongol Khans.
Right. Yes, Kublai's death was long expected, and I would say long overdue. Everybody would have probably been better off if he had died much earlier after the conquest of southern Song. And power passed into his grandson, uh, who was named Timur Ojetu, or Timur Han, or Timur, Emperor Timur, we used to call him. And he was a new person. He's not very well respected in history. He's often referred to as being a drunk, but that's not true. He had been a heavy drinker when he was young, and Kublai had been extremely strict about that. He had seen the great damage that alcohol had done to his own father. His own father had died in an alcoholic stupor. He had seen this, and although Kublai Khan didn't abstain from all alcohol, he drank fermented horse milk. He did not like his grandson being drunk, and he several times had his grandson punished. He even had him caned in the court in public before everybody. So eventually, the grandson gave up drinking. So he
Mhm.
was not a drunk. He had had a problem early in life. He was not a drunk. And he recognized the value of that navy was for trade. That was his great realization. Forget the army. And he sent out envoys all over to every place they could go to say, we are not invading anymore. We're not sending any more armies. We only want trade. We only want peace with you. And in fact, the longest report that survived from that was from Cambodia, a report from Cambodia that was never a threat, really. The Mongols never really threatened, or was never really a threat to them anyway. But these reports mostly lost, but he sent them out, and he formed also peace with the Mongols. That was the hardest part of all. All these Mongols,
Mhm.
even the Russian, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate of Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia, all of them swore allegiance to him. So he's now ruling the largest empire in the world, at least in theory, and it's connected by trade. That's what everybody is valuing. And he's reinstituting, he's now sending off all this tribute that the people did receive from their property that they owned. So they have 20 some years of property, due them profits. He's sending it, he's making great relations. And so this was the great era of prosperity for the world, this great system that was created.
Mm. So he actually did what his dad or Kublai wasn't able to do,
What his grandfather, Kublai, was not
what his
able to do.
grandfather was.
Correct,
Mm.
correct. And, the trade went mostly to the Persian Gulf, but from there, then other ships, uh, after that, mostly Arab ships, would continue it on into Egypt and down the African coasts, and certainly to Somalia, at least we know. And then other trade goods would go over land to the Mediterranean and were trading with Europe. So Tatar cloth, as they called it in Europe, became very, very popular. This
Mm.
was actually manufactured in the Middle East under the Mongols in the Middle East, but it became very popular at that time.
I find it fascinating that this whole network of commerce and just empires all started all from just someone 100 years, like 150 years before that. Like,
Yes,
it's
yes,
incredible how
yes,
that can happen.
yes. Everything
To
goes back to Genghis Khan. It's
Yeah.
it's amazing. People, with some people think that it's not great people in history who change history are the great men of history. But these
True.
other forces don't operate without humans. It's always human. It's the human story. And certainly
Mhm.
the Mongol Empire is a human story of great triumph, of failure, of success, of everything you can imagine. But almost the same can be said for any great empire then or now.
Mhm. And what do you think, as last question, future politicians, future leaders can maybe learn from someone like Kublai? This could be mistakes, but it could also be something positive.
I think that from him and from his grandfather, Genghis Khan, there are certain lessons they have in common. One was they really were willing to try things and to fail. That's very important. And not to pretend it was a victory when it was not a victory. If you fail, you fail. Uh, so then you try something else and you do it a different way. This is very important. And I think all of us, if you ask us, oh, yes, I learned from all my mistakes all the time. Yeah, we learn from our mistakes and we do the same mistake over and over and over. I see it in my own life. I see it in people around. We claim to be learning from our mistakes, but we're repeating the same mistakes. We can't
Mm-hmm.
really think beyond that. We don't know a new way. But the Mongols, especially Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan, were very good at learning from their mistakes. Acknowledge the mistakes, change it, try something else. Failure is not a failure unless you fail in the end. To fail along the way with this step or that step, that's not a failure. And over and over, I think that proved very valuable. The last great innovation of the Mongols was to develop this great navy, become a sea power. And then the final step was when his Timur, his grandson, made it into the greatest trade empire in the world. So this is a long way. You've changed this empire tremendously over time, but it's through a sequence of many little failures and many great victories.
Mm. Yeah. The product of trying, 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 trying.
Yes, keep
Well,
trying, keep trying.
mhm.
And it worked for a long time.
Thank you, Jack, for taking the time. If anyone's interested in
Uh,
the book, like they'll be able to find it. Link will be
yeah.
in the description. And yeah, it was a honor talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your interest.